The following podcast may be explicit. One Joe Young presents Adventures from the Shed, a tabletop RPG podcast. You can find us online at adventuresfromtheshed.com.
Welcome to one of our special Sidebar episodes where we talk about issues related to gaming rather than recording actual play. Today, Joe and our special guest, Chris, help me think about how to structure combat encounters in my adventures. JJ and Mickie also chime in. Hope you find this enjoyable and enlightening.
Hello and welcome to the Shed for Adventures from the Shed. This is a special Sidebar episode. It's going to be moderated not by the illustrious mighty Joe Young, but instead by Kurt Schumacher. Why is that? Because I've got something I want to learn about today, and I've got a special limited cast and crew of illustrious dungeon masters, game masters, and the wife of a game master and talented player. We're going to go around the table and introduce ourselves, but before we do that, remember, you can find us at adventuresfromtheshed.com. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Bing. You can find us on iTunes. You can find us perhaps
Stitcher Radio,
somewhere that you shouldn't find us. But you know what? Throw us into Google. You'll find us. So we're going to start at the left with the king.
The king
of the Shed, one mighty Joe Young.
Oh, that would be me. I am Joe, and I am a part of the podcast that Kurt is currently moderating today.
Joe, you're not just a part. You're like
you're
the fulcrum around which we.
You're the keystone.
You are the keystone.
The keystone, the fulcrum.
Yeah.
So you are the Pennsylvania of this group.
I am.
You are the heart.
Excellent.
Could have been Keister, though. I'm not sure.
Next.
Translation.
JJ here. I'll be playing the part of a someone with expertise, apparently.
Okay.
This is Chris. I'll also be someone with expertise, hopefully, to help Kurt out here.
And we have...
Hi, everyone. This is Mickie. I may or may not speak up. I apparently am here to even out the gender bias.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I put Mickie last because I feel like she and I are...
Because she deserves to be last.
No. She deserves to be first.
Oh, dear God.
She is a goddess among women. But she and I are in the same boat. The reason we're doing this sidebar is because, one, I love Sidebar podcasts. These are the podcasts where we talk about mechanics of gaming or how to game or how to run a game or something cool that's happening in Dungeons & Dragons or Dungeon World or RPG Land. And I love them, and I wanted to do one. But particularly, I am thinking about running a home game soon, and it'll be my first game. And I know this is something Mickie has thought about as well, which is why she's here.
Absolutely.
So we are here today to learn from Chris and JJ and Joe about how to design an encounter. Not how to run a campaign, not how to think about your world, not how to come up with awesome NPCs, but when you've got people at a table who want to play and you've got them on the road and they met at the tavern and they had drinks and they love each other and they're going and they walk into their first cave, their first dungeon, their first side alley, and they encounter bad guys. As a game master, whether it's Dungeons & Dragons, whether it's Shadowrun, whether it's Dungeon World, and maybe we can talk about the differences there, but I guess I'm thinking mostly kind of 5e, something where you've got hit points, where you've got challenge ratings. How do you know how many bad guys to put in there, what type of bad guys, how strong they are, and how does the ability level or character level of your party players affect that calculus? It's a big question, but I'm kind of looking for a specific answer. And knowing this group, I'm imagining they're not going to give a formula and say you get 3 guys with this many hit points minus this CR to Y. But having said that, let's spend 15, 20, 25 minutes talking about it.
Okay, and cut.
Since we have a special guest, I want to throw it over to Chris first.
Cool. Yeah, you could do it that way if you want to be mathematical. I think that's kind of pointless. Like, for me, it's like if you're playing music and you're just like gonna go exactly by the notes and no feel, that's worthless to me, you know. So for me, being a DM, I try to be cinematic about it. Like, how would the scene play out? So I don't really care if I have the right amount of, like, this many bad guys against equal amount of this many good guys, you know. That doesn't matter, I don't think. You want to try to have it where it's gonna, even if they're like outnumbered, just have it be like an epic scene where they could still cut through maybe a bunch of schlep low-level guys, and maybe have a couple like high-level guys that are equal to the number, but they still have to get through this like pile of like low-level guys first, and then deal with the bigger guys. So never go by numbers. I think that's just a waste of time.
Awesome. So JJ, if you've got a totally new GM, totally new, and he's got the monster manual in front of him or something equivalent, what does he think about in creating that first encounter?
I would recommend, first when you first design the encounter, go with the location first. Where are you? What monsters make sense where you are? And just because the monster manual says kobolds are, quarter CR or half CR, at most 2 CR, you can put class levels on them and raise their CR. You can make those kobolds as powerful as you'd like. You don't have to stick with the monster manual. Now, that's a little bit more advanced than just, basically running it from the stat block in the monster manual. But what I would definitely say is make the location real.
Okay, so before we move on from that, can you just, for the people at home, one, kind of give a definition or a general sense of what CR is, and two, if you want to modify CR, do you do that just by adding hit points, or is there something else to that?
Challenge rating is essentially the game's mechanic of basically leveling the playing field between the players. And the way I've been doing it, and it's worked out really well for me, and I don't think it's the official rules, but I add up the total CR of the players. So say I have 4 level 2 players. That gives me a CR of 8. If I choose a total CR of 8 from the monster manual, that should be an equivalent fight. So that would be, at quarter CR Goblin, that would be 4 for each player. No, sorry, 8 for each player. So that should be equivalent fight.
Okay. All right.
So CR challenge rating is the level of the characters, the sum of the level of the characters versus the monsters,
and that's
quote unquote
that's how
CR.
I've been doing it. I don't think that's the official way, but it's worked out very, very well for me.
Right. Okay, so Joe, I know you're a little more fluid, particularly because you like Dungeon World a little bit more than the rules-heavy games. But let's say you've got an encounter and you've set it up in whatever rule set, and you realize either your monsters are underpowered relative to what you want kind of the cinematic quality of the scene to be, or overpowered, in the sense that, like, maybe you want this to be a very challenging encounter for the players, and all of a sudden you realize, like, they're going to plow through these dudes in 10 minutes. As a game master, what do you do there?
One of the easy things to do, for me at least, is if you know the monsters are the monsters you want there, use the environment to make the change. So if your players are about to just plow through the bunch of kobolds that are there, and you want them not to, change it so the kobolds now have the high ground, right? Give them advantage on their rolls. Think D&D mechanics. Maybe the kobolds now have advantage because they have the high ground, the players have the low ground. And you could just flip it just as easily the other way around. You can make it so that the terrain between them is difficult terrain. Make it so there's a chasm that the players have to jump over, or there's a pit or some kind of trap or something. Use the environment that can make a big difference, not just the change in monsters. And the flip side to that is, say you can't change the environment, and the environment is exactly how you want it. The monsters are how you want it. None of the monsters in your world should live in a vacuum. They have friends. They have people they're working with. Maybe the kobolds have the kobold chieftain that needs to come in and join the fight if the fight is too easy. Find a way to augment that. And if you didn't plan it ahead of time, just think about it during the combat. Maybe on the fourth round, somebody says, one of the kobolds shouts an alarm, and then you give the players 2 more rounds to actually do something before somebody joins that combat. Right. That's one way to tip the tide, one way or another.
Awesome. Those are great points. Mickie?
So what happens if it's the opposite? So what you're describing to me sounds how you would compensate if the encounter was too easy.
Or too hard.
Or
you
too
can
difficult?
flip it in both directions.
Okay, so what do? Do you start fudging hit points, or?
Well, that's a whole separate question. I don't know if you were going to get to that one.
Well, I was going to ask about fudging hit points or having monsters run away, or what happens when you realize you overpowered an encounter from the monster
side. It might depend on the story, or like, for example, you might have a very powerful bad guy, but you crank up his hit points, but maybe you lower his armor class, so they could definitely hit this guy, but it's going to take a while to bring him down. Or you reverse it, maybe he's got low hit points, but they could almost hit him like out of 4 attacks or hit him like 1 time, Right. So it's just taking a while. It just depends how you want the story to go. If you want the quick fight or get it over with fast, or what you want to do. Right. And then the same thing, if it gets too hard, maybe it's too hard for them, you can bring in in my campaigns, I have like a lot of NPCs, to help out if they want to come in and like bolster, the heroes.
Right. How is encounter design different if you're playing on a grid game versus a theater of the mind game? So, if you're playing 3.5 or Pathfinder, which a lot of people are still playing and which is a great game, how is that different, JJ, in particular? I'm thinking because you're playing both.
I think with the map environment definitely becomes more real. You have to worry about line of sight issues. Corners, trees, shrubbery, that all kind of adds into it. You can create choke points with Theater of the Mind or with environment, but with Theater of Mind, it's a little bit more fluid. But with Theater of Mind, it's easier to set off traps, because you didn't have a designated spot on the map marked as a trap. I think with the map, it's a little bit easier to visualize the battlefield. It's more strategic in a way than Theater of the Mind.
Awesome.
So let me chime in on that one for a moment, because for me, one of the big things when you go to grid-based, when you go to a map, is the stat block matters a whole lot more. So when you read in the stat block adjacent on the map, that means 2 squares touching each other. On Theater of the Mind, that means they're near each other. There's a huge difference there when you're describing it. Yeah. So if on the map you have 2 goblins standing next to each other, and they have in their stat block something that says when they're standing next to each other, they increase their AC by 2. When they're adjacent, well, on the map you can see that they're touching each other. And when players, especially in encounter design, when players walk into a group of goblins that are all standing next to each other in a line on a map, it is a lot more obvious that when you describe in Theater of the Mind, you walk in and there are 4 goblins near each other. There's a huge difference there.
That's a good point.
It's a big difference in the play style, because the players may then think of Fireball. Fireball is going to hit a certain radius. And in Theater of the Mind, you're thinking, first off, are they close enough together? On a map, you know right away. As soon as you open that door, you know that they're within your 30-foot radius, whatever it is. So that plays a big role in encounter design.
Yeah, that's a good point. I definitely feel like there are a lot of times in 5e, which for us is Theater of the Mind, where we've kind of done something and said, are they close enough? And you've kind of said, well, yeah.
Yeah. Which is far enough. That's
which is cool, but it's different from on a grid.
Yeah.
I also feel like attacks of opportunity and reach are less significant in our 5e games than they would be in a 3.5, 3.7.5 Pathfinder game.
Or 4th edition, which we haven't played.
Yeah, which I've just never played it. That's why I don't mention 4th at all. Chris, do you distinguish between the use of minions and main bad guys? And what I mean by that is, how do you throw out the low-level 1 or 2 hits and they're dead guys versus your main bad guys in an encounter?
For me, like if I had these powerful villains, they're villains, okay? They're just not minions, they're villains. They might have names, they might have a backstory, they have an agenda, they're trying to do something, To them, they're the heroes, not the bad guys, So they're characters as well, They're NPCs, but they're villains. So those low-level guys are just nobody. So they're the red shirts. I don't care about what happens to those guys. I'm just throwing at them to like bug the players, There's no interaction, there's no banter back and forth. They're just a wave of damage. That's all they're doing, So that's, for me, that's how I kind of break it up, Like a villain might have a name. He might be like that guy you've heard of before, or that old dragon. Like, man, I know that guy. He's been around. He's, not somebody easy just to push over.
But in planning for that encounter, those minions still take time. They still take actions that the players have to use to deal with them before they get to the big guy. So I guess what I'm wondering as kind of a new GM is, if my players are spending their first round or two killing the one-hit goblins or whatever, the one-hit kobolds, that's time where your big bad vampire is powering up his, power attacks and doing damage to you. How do you balance that?
It's really up to, it's going to be the tactics the players want to do. They might be like, all right, you guys go after these low-level guys, keep them busy. I'm going after the main bad guy. If he's a vampire, maybe it's the paladin. I'm aiming for him. You guys take out these other guys, run interference for me.
JJ, what's the hardest thing? Because you're a very experienced DM and you've played in a lot of systems. What's the hardest thing if you're playing with a group of experienced players when you say, I want these guys to walk into this particular room or this particular dungeon and have a challenging encounter? What's the hardest thing to plan?
Creating different aspects to that, because with experienced players, they've memorized the monster manual backwards and forwards. I mean, you said you read through the whole thing. You're trying to become more experienced players, so you know generally what every monster in the book can do. One of my favorite things is like where I throw a wrinkle in there that the players weren't expecting. Case in point, the one time I told Joe, he was fighting one-on-one with something, and I said, you get some kind of feedback. You hear like a ringing in your head, and he's like, all right, well, I'm gonna open up my can of whoop ass on this creature, and it was a psychic feedback. So all the damage Joe did to the creature, he did to himself. It's just a wrinkle that isn't, it's just you got to have wrinkles. Like one of my favorite things with the whole low-level guys is creating a multi-tiered fight. So, like, my players came into a room, into a goblin warren. The goblins had managed to capture a werewolf, but the players didn't know this, and they were messing around with the werewolf. So when the players killed the goblins, the werewolf had, finally woken up, gone into a rage, and came busting out of the cage. And the players had just finished, wiping out the goblins. Now they got to deal with the werewolf.
Right.
It's making a multi-tiered combats in order to challenge the players.
Awesome. You raised a point that I wanted to ask about. So, Joe, I'll ask you, and there may not be a good answer to this, but I think it's a tricky question of kind of how you deal with metagaming knowledge of the bad guys, particularly in D&D, where even if you don't read the monster manual start to finish, most people who play know that certain creatures have certain vulnerabilities, resistances, strengths, powers. And in theory, I guess the players shouldn't be using that at the table. But as a practical matter, we are. I mean, a skeleton doesn't take piercing damage. How do you, if at all, deal with that?
I like to make up monsters. That's my short answer for it.
That's a great answer.
For the most part, the monsters that we fight and the games that we play are monsters that I've made up. And the way that players get advantage is what you guys did in the game that we just played. Chris had asked a couple of times, do I know any weakness about this monster? Right? That is where it comes up. So it's not a player knowledge, it's a learned character knowledge throughout. That doesn't help for a new GM who wants to play out of the book. The best you can do, in my opinion, is you ask the players to be adults. Yes, they're going to use some of their knowledge, but one of my biggest problems is I hate an adversarial relationship. I never feel it is the DM versus the players. I never feel that. That's just me. I hate that. And I know a lot of people think it's the way to go. If you've got a player that's being a prick at the table, kill them. Kill their character. Get done with it, right?
That's how my older brother runs, man. It's him against the character. Not cool.
So I don't like that. There are people that take that path, and maybe at the right table that works, and you just kill the character off, not the player, and maybe anyway, yeah. Once that's done, once you get to that point where you have that understanding at the table, then if somebody steps over that line, you just say right out, how would your character know that? Right. Just ask it straight up. Don't beat around the bush. Just how would your character know that? Because if you don't give me a good reason, then we're going to say your character didn't know it.
Right.
And move on from there.
Especially if you have people reading adventures ahead of time, like,
Oh, gosh. Right. Published adventures. Yeah.
But you got to throw, like he said, throw the curveballs in,
Right. So Joe raised a great point. Or actually,
I did?
in what Joe was saying, you raised a point about your brother and the way he just kills players. How do you deal with player death? There are times where even if you're not being a dick, for lack of a better word, as a GM.
Actually, player death is much different from character death.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Sorry.
Yeah,
how do you deal with
dig a hole?
You're totally right. How do you deal with character death where you're not necessarily trying to kill them? You weren't being a jerk, but they rolled bad, and especially at level 1 in 5e, like they're dead.
I know I was just talking, but let me start this one.
Yeah.
Because we handle it, I think, in our podcast different. I think everybody who's in the podcast, except Chris, I guess, because he isn't here normally, probably knows. Before we start every adventure, I ask, are you all right with your character dying? I mean, this to me is very important. I want to know if the player is okay with the character death. I think that's important. I do this in my regular games too, in that I want to know, because if I have a player who says they're not okay with the investment in their character going away, I will make a conscious effort to make sure that character doesn't die. We don't need an unhappy player at the table. Yet, if there's somebody who says, I'm fine with my character dying because maybe I wanted to play something different anyway, let's make a glorious death out of it so that we can have a tale to talk about and let that player move on to the character they wanted to play next. So I just want to throw that out there because we've had that experience here.
That's great.
Yeah, I think the character death, it just adds facets to the story. Like it could cause the party to refocus their, have a very singular focus on a goal, for vengeance for this character, so on and so forth. Or possibly, you have some kind of nether region of hell or something. You got to go and rescue the soul.
Yes.
It just adds more to the adventure.
Cool.
Yeah, that was perfect. I agree with him. It's kind of like you could still use that death as like another piece of the campaign to continue along. Like
it's
you said,
definitely a plot hook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you might have to rework it where that person might have to play somebody else for a session, or maybe have them take the place of an NPC for a time if they can get there. If they want to keep another character, do something like that.
Awesome.
So it serves as a catalyst.
Yeah, it could
to drive the story.
Unless
forward.
it's like Joe said, just get rid of that person anyway. We don't care.
I've got a question. Yeah. So, as GMs, how do you deal with the unexpected? Because the one rule
nothing unexpected ever happens.
All these games is the players never do what you expect them to do.
I'll take this. Well, I'll take it first, I guess. You got to roll with the punches. Like, for example, I was running like the Savage Tide campaign. It deals with a lot of demons and stuff. Demogorgon. You're dealing with Igwil, like the Witch Queen, and you make alliances with these demon lords to fight this, all these, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type thing. And obviously Igwil was going to screw you over later. Well, one of the characters pulled a fast one on her. I'm like, all right, I got to roll with that. He betrayed her, and all right, I guess she's not going to pull off her plan. You just got to kind of like improv, that's the path. I wanted the path to go this way, and now we're going this way. Okay, but eventually I'll get it back to where I need it to be for like the end fight or whatever I need to do. You just kind of like got to take that detour,
Right.
So what's a good rule of thumb? Sorry, I'm taking over.
No, that's great.
What's a good rule of thumb for a newbie GM? Like how many, quote unquote, little encounters do you plan? So like for a 1 hour play session, how many do you pre-plan? How many little battles or encounters do you plan?
That's definitely taking a litmus test of your players. Find out what their personalities are like. Case in point, our Dungeon World game has turned from a very combat-centric to a very role-play-oriented thing, and I don't think Joe's made a couple of comments about it, just going, this is a complete role reversal of what you guys were doing. Yep. And
that's a big change. I would say that based on that, and it's kind of echoing what JJ just said, but what I look for is you can have as many of your little sidetracks as you want, as long as everyone on the table is still smiling.
Yep.
Even if I'm not, I'm still overruled, outnumbered. Put those together, I'm overnumbered. But as far as planning it, if you're not running a pre-published campaign, because this is very important, if you're running a published campaign, then just follow it and steer people back to where it needs to go to finish it, especially if you're new and you're just trying to follow it by the book. Don't be ashamed to say, like we did with the D&D starter set and others we've run.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, it's not in the book. We can't handle that right now. Here's what we can do. Right. And, don't be ashamed to give somebody a freebie. Maybe the only information the blacksmith has is that's a magical sword. And if somebody wants to ask them 20 other questions and they just keep going to say, look, I'm sorry, all I have here is that's a magical sword. So don't bother with any other questions. And that allows you, in a pre-published adventure, to stick. Now, if you've written, say, 3 adventures or 3 encounters, you think it's going to last you the game session, and by the end of the first encounter, you're almost done with the time you've set aside. If everyone's happy, you don't necessarily need to push back to the original the original line. And if you've written it that you have to complete A to start B to get to C, then maybe in between sessions come up with a way to go from A to C. Right?
Well, that actually, and I know other people have something to add, but I want to jump in there because something, I read a lot of books about game mastering and dungeon mastering and all the kind of classic texts. And there's this idea that, the dungeon master really doesn't want to plan out the adventure. And your players are the ones who create the adventure, and you have a framework. But having said that, I, knowing myself, I'm going to have encounters in mind. I'm going to have traps in mind that I want to see. And some of the things I've read have said literally like, your players come to a fork in the road. You've got a trap on the left. They go right. Then they never see your trap. And to me, that doesn't make any sense because it seems to me if I've got a good trap in mind, why don't I just put that somewhere down the road on the right fork? And if I've got a dungeon in mind that they never went to because they didn't go that way, why don't I just pop that in on the second floor down the path that they did take? I mean, is there any reason that my thinking is wrong there?
No, you could always do that. You could always have, like, no matter which fork in the road they pick, a trap is always going to be that trap is always going to be there.
I mean, if you've got a great idea.
Yeah, always. Yeah. You can always kind of like, that's how you kind of use NPCs. You kind of, not that you railroad or force your players, but like, hey, you guys need to go check this out because whatever. Yeah. You kind of force them to, like, you kind of set that in motion, Yeah,
I mean, the only reason I ask that question is in some of the kind of classic books, there's this idea that almost like you have a map in your head, and if your PCs don't go to that side of the map, they never see it. Yep. Which to me just doesn't make sense because I would take the great stuff from there and just move it over here. So it sounds like we're in agreement there.
And the same thing is like, so the DM has this great idea and he wants to implement it. At the same time, you don't want to punish a player if they have a great idea and they choose to implement it. Case in point, I was reading one story where it was a newbie DM with a new group of 4 players. So everyone was new to D&D completely, and they were playing the Lost Mines of Phandelver. And the player got this brilliant idea to get like a bunch of sheep's fur. And
beaver's pelts?
Beaver's pelt, maybe. And they were going to smoke out the cave, the original Goblin Cave, to force all the goblins to come out. And the DM was like, he's like, well, that doesn't make any sense because there's no way they can handle every single one of these baddies at the same time. Because the way the dungeon design is set up is you handle this group, you handle this group, you handle this group, so on and so forth. If all the goblins that were in that cave came pouring out the mouth of the cave at the same time, it would overwhelm the level 1 group and they'd all be dead. Right. So, the newbie DM brilliant. He said there was a back entrance or a back exit to the cave instead of, I don't think that's part of the, I'd never actually read it.
I don't remember it for sure. But
or there's a chimney in the second room and the air gets out, but the first guys come out.
Don't penalize, don't say no to the players.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So
also, let me add one more thing. You got your great trap. If the players find a way around it, let them.
Yeah.
Don't just force the trap on them. If they have a clever way around it, whatever it may be, let them do it. Because otherwise, you're taking away their clever idea. Your clever ideas they didn't know about. You've just learned about theirs. Right. Let that one shine. Throw your clever idea in later when they have, stupid ideas.
Right. So Mickie
it's inevitable.
No, that's great. So Mickie, you may have other questions. I guess my last question would be if you kind of were thinking about advice to a new GM with respect to encounter design, what would you tell them not to do? And you may have already hit on this, but what are the 1 or 2 things that make sure you avoid in planning for this? What would you say, Chris?
Oh man,
what not to do?
Well, I can say that don't ignore your players. Don't just look at your stat blocks and your everything else. Look at your players. Are they smiling? Are they enjoying themselves? If they're on their phones, if they're doing something else, they're not enjoying themselves. They're bored. And that's when you need to either cut the encounter short because it's going entirely too long, or you need to do some kind of external variable to make it more exciting. You got to just something to re-engage the players.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like things what not to do. I mean, yeah, it's like you said, don't make sure everybody's having fun. It's the same thing. Like, is it too much combat or too much role playing? Like, got to find that happy medium. I don't know. Like for me, it's just it's more about the story than like what's the action. Sometimes like what's the whole picture as opposed to like one little piece of it.
Yeah, it's funny for us because on a podcast, if you look at kind of our day of gaming, I feel like we generally have great balance. But if you look at it in 1 hour segments, like our first hour today, with no combat,
role play,
really pretty mellow role play. Yeah. And then if you look at it in 1 hour segments, it's not balanced. But if you look at it as a day, we almost always have a really good balance of what we're doing.
I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Well Joe, any final thoughts?
Let me add something that I would not do is don't overwhelm the characters on your first encounter. Make it damn easy. They should shine. They should come out of that first encounter, and I'm talking new GM, new players, that goblin ambush that we went through. The first time we played and had a bad recording, and I think everybody got wiped out.
Yeah, that was nasty.
It was rough. Or actually, the first one was easy.
First one we wiped
the first one was easy. The second one, It was different.
2 people went down the second try.
But try to design your first encounter so the players come away thinking, I am really playing a hero. Then,
or at least someone who could become a hero.
Right.
Yeah.
Gradually then make it more difficult. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people dismayed that their character died in their first combat.
Yeah.
Aw.
You could lose a new player like that.
Right, a
that's
brand
no fun.
new player,
Yeah.
first combat. I'm playing a wizard with 4 hit points, and you drop from the ceiling with
Yeah.
some shadowy Night Stalker thingy that just hits me for 25, and my wizard that I just spent 3 hours creating is dead. So I should roll up a ranger then, right? Because they have more hit points and they can hit harder. That's what you're telling me? So you can disillusion somebody away from what they wanted by overdoing it at the beginning. Let them shine, especially, in my opinion, through your entire first session. Let them leave your game table thinking, I'm playing a cool character.
Right. Awesome. Mickie, other questions while we're here?
He answered my question.
Yeah.
My other question, I guess, would be, so as a brand new GM, do you play with experienced players or do you play with newbie players? Is it going to be a case of the blind leading the blind? Or
I don't think it matters. So, like for me, you don't want to be like rule centric, where it's like, oh, they know all the rules, so they're trying to like bypass a bunch of things. Like that's not how it should work. It's however you want it to play out. You know, what kind of story you want to tell, and they're just having their input. You know, putting their variables in.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like I worry about GMing for JJ, for example. Even though I love him personally, I feel like I wouldn't even be in the same universe in terms of knowing the rules or how to run the combat. So part of me is like, I want to do a game, but I don't want JJ to be there. Even though, like, I'd love to play with JJ, I don't, so that's I don't know that there's a real answer to that. But I guess
just the answer is just don't play with a-holes.
That would be J-holes, because I fit there.
Well,
too.
no, but I think part of that, Joe had reached out to me and said, he wouldn't mind playing with me. And I guess part of that is just being upfront and honest with your players about what are you looking for, what are you getting, what can I offer, and if you've got someone who's going to be a hardcore rules lawyer and that's what they want, like I'm not going to be the GM for them. If they want someone who's going to try to tell a really good story and just have fun for a few hours and drink beer, maybe that's my game.
Yeah, and plus I think too you need to the DM he has the final call, man. He's running the game. And
or she.
You're right. And don't be like a dick about it like it's my way or the highway. If the group's like they're having trouble, like, well, would this be plausible to come off? I think you try to have a consensus, but I think he should have, he or she should have the final call on that.
Right. I totally agree.
He or the
Having said that, without belaboring the point, I do think that's difficult for a new GM to say to someone like a JJ or a Joe, nah, I'm going to rule this way, even when you're probably wrong. But I hear what you're saying, and that's great.
But to be fair, though, the only time you need to rule is when there's a discrepancy at the table. So you're only picking a side. Right.
Yeah.
And in that case, what you're doing as the DM or the GM is you're coming down on somebody's side. You at least have one friend in this conflict. So don't worry so much about what the rule is, because house rules. I mean, we all do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and to some degree, you can rely on, like you often will say, JJ, I'm going to look to you for these rules so that I can focus on the story or I can focus on the encounter or whatever.
And here's where you take it upon yourself as DM to say that's your ruling. Your ruling is to take the advice, the determination of that player.
Right. I think that's
you're giving them the gavel to bang at that point.
Yeah.
At which point the rule comes into effect. Yeah.
That's great. Final thoughts before we close, Joe?
I'm great. Thank you.
Actually, just say you're awesome.
Oh, I'm awesome. Yeah, my Kofi says I'm awesome. Let me just throw in there for a minute. It really depends, and Kurt, you mentioned this earlier. Have an upfront conversation with your players. Don't wait until after your first session. After your first session, you should be asking, did everything we talk about meet your expectations? It should be a job interview, essentially. Before you start, you should be talking about, here's how I plan to run. I want you guys to be heroes. I mean, remember, when we started this, and I say this on almost all of my games because I don't like adversarial characters. I want cooperative characters in my game. It's the only way my game works. So talk to them. What type of game do you want to run? Is it going to be high magic, low magic? Is it going to be heroic? Is it going to be sinister? Are the players going to be playing in a gritty scene? Get everything up front. Talk about character death. Talk about how long your sessions should last and all of that stuff. Because at the end of your sessions, you should be asking for feedback on if everything went the way you expected, and if not, move on to fix it, to change it. That's what I would say. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier, Kurt, so I wanted to hit that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
As far as like the whole rules versus story thing, I think one good implementation of that is something Joe and I have done, which is the co-DM. That was a lot of fun. I was able to do nothing but basically encounter design and that sort of stuff, and Joe, pushed the story along.
I played an NPC that I got players to actually hate.
Really hate.
Really, I've done that before.
Almost decked him.
Yeah.
Just
Physical.
inches away from
It
decking
wasn't
him.
Saunders, was it?
No, it wasn't Saunders.
Everybody
it was forgetful shopkeeper.
Excellent. Chris, any final thoughts?
Just a little bit of reiteration on like Joe said. Like we're like know your players. Like are they more Game of Thrones or more Gallivant? Or is it hardcore violence and sex and violence, or is it more lighthearted hero thing going on? And figure out what kind of stuff, because my stuff's more hardcore and violent, and even though it's fantasy, I try to do hyper realism with the combat, things like that. So yeah, just figure out what you guys like, or I throw in a lot of intrigue and stuff and political machinations going on where my guys would get into that, but other people might be like, that's so boring, I just want to hack and slash all day. So you got to figure that out.
Right.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
Hey,
I want
guys.
to hear if Mickie has any final thoughts.
No, that's interesting. Is it either tits and hits or gore? And
Right.
I like it.
That's cool. Y'all, this was very, very helpful to me. I appreciate you taking the time to stay today to record a little sidebar for Adventures from the Shed. This is Adventures from the Shed. Check us out at adventuresfromtheshed.com. We are going to sign off by saying thank you for listening.
Thank you,
Bye,
guys.
Until next
everyone.
time. Bye-bye.
Later.
I feel like I'm the only girl here.
As someone preparing to jump into the world of game mastering, I found this discussion fascinating and helpful. I felt like a Padawan to the Jedi Masters, and I appreciated all of their thoughts. We hope you enjoyed this sidebar from the shed. Now go forth and play, or even better, run a game and introduce the world of gaming to some great new players.
The preceding podcast was brought to you by One Joe Young. You can find us online at adventuresfromtheshed.com.